Hey, how's it going, everyone? My name's Alex. I am the Two-Way Penciler. Welcome to my YouTube channel, and welcome to my video on how to draw Hunk from Resident Evil 2. Now, in this video demonstration, I'm going to be talking about techniques I used, such as varying my line weight, cross-hatching, rendering, as well as lighting and shading in order to create this illustration. Now, I invite you to come over to my drafting table in order for us to get this demonstration on the way. Come on, let's go. Alright, here we go with the beginning of the demonstration. Before I begin talking about my process, what you might all notice is that my initial lay-in or my underdrawing has already been established. The reason for this is because this usually takes me quite a while to complete, especially if the character is all armored up with guns, grenades, whatnot. So I just went ahead and did that before recording to save some time. So right here what I'm doing is I'm just lining it up. I spoke earlier about varying line weights, and pertaining to that, what I'll usually do is on the lines that are facing away from the light, I'll tend to make them thicker and darker. Any lights that go towards the light, contrarily, they will get a lot thinner. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll even leave gaps in between those thin lines in order to show that that area is very bright, or probably even blown out by the light source. Another thing too, varying line weights. In order to keep the drawing interesting, you don't want to make all your lines, I guess you could say, look equally balanced, or like with the same, I guess, width or strength, because if it all looks too even, it'll tend to get boring. So what I'll tend to do is I will make a line starting with a thin taper, and as I go in towards the center of the line, I'll make it thicker, and as it reaches the end of the other side of the line, I'll thin it out again, and that gives your drawing a lot more interest rather than just making the entire thing with the same line weight, the same strength. You don't want to make it boring. You want to make it as interesting as possible, and that's one of the techniques I've learned from studying other artists. It's just vary your line weight. Try not to make it all too similar. One thing you might notice me doing here is using a piece of paper in order to prevent my hand from touching the drawing. I do this in order to prevent the graphite from smudging. I mean, regardless of doing that, it'll smudge eventually. You can't really prevent that. The type of lead I use is a 2H. It's actually harder, so it creates harder, crisper lines. That's usually the industry standard for what comic book artists use, and I mean, I started using it, and I really like it. It gives me good results. So yeah, I just use a piece of paper to prevent the smudging, but as I said, it's inevitable. It's gonna smudge eventually. What I've seen other artists use is actually a piece of wood or some kind of plank that they will place above the drawing. It pretty much floats above the drawing, so when they put their hand on it or their arm, it doesn't touch any part of the paper. So the only part that touches the paper is the graphite or the lead, so there's pretty much no smudging at all. I myself haven't used that technique, but it looks like it works. So now the way I'll do my lines is I try not to pet the line, I guess you can call it, because what that usually results in is what's known as a hairy line. So in order for me to stop that from happening, the way I do the lines is I just do one quick confident stroke Sometimes I will build it up sometimes, but not too much. I try to just create a line with one smooth movement of my arm or wrist, depending on how big the area is. Right now what I'm doing is putting just a couple little details in Hunk's helmet, a couple of faded out lines, feathering it out. This is a technique I learned from David Finch, where you start a set of thick lines at the very bottom or from the base, wherever you're starting, and then as you come out of it, you basically feather out. And I do that a lot of times. It works. It looks really cool. So right here, put in a couple more small lines. Now right here, what I'm about to do is use an ellipse tool or lip stencils to draw out the little lenses on Hunk's gas mask. This is really helpful because it helps, it helps get a perfect circle or a perfect sphere. A lot of times I'll have to freehand these depending on how big I make them, because I only have a certain amount of sizes that I can use at my disposal. So sometimes I can use these, sometimes I can't. In this occasion I was able to use these, so these help a lot. Gonna cut to some sped up footage right here. Make it go a little bit faster. Right here I'm doing some detailing on the little straps on Hunk's attire. I just made a couple of zigzags, add those up. As you can see, as it builds up and up, it creates a really cool looking texture. I end up doing this on certain other parts of his costume where he has straps or something like that. Just speeding through this drawing a little bit more. It's still using the same techniques I spoke about: line weights, line variation. Just progressing on the upper torso. Alright, right here is where I started doing the shading. Changed the angle a bit to give it more interest, and you'll notice that some of the spots are marked with an X. That's a technique used by comic book pencilers in order to show inkers where certain areas are supposed to be darkened in. This is actually used as a time saver for when artists are on a deadline. So I just went ahead and used that because I was actually just laying in where my shadows were going to be, so it just let me know what's going to be in shadow, what's going to be in light. Continuing the shading here. The best advice I could give to you guys with shading is to learn your planes. Learn about the planes of the face, the planes of the body. Planes have a lot to do with shading. Basically, the planes that face away from a light source are going to get darker. The planes that face more towards the light are going to be a lot lighter. I would go more into detail in this, but you know, I don't want to extend the video too much. But basically just study your planes, study lighting and shading, look at references, study from life, I guess, you know, figures. If you have a figure drawing course next to where you live, go ahead and attend that, and just pay attention to the lighting, pay attention to the planes. Like I said, study your planes, and just remember, what faces the light gets lighter, what moves away from the light gets darker. That's essentially what it's really all about. Continuing the shading here, what I'm doing on this part is just put it in cast shadow. Cast shadow is basically when one object prevents another object from receiving light. And yeah, again, you'll notice I'm skipping around. I try not to make this too long. It's already getting long enough. So yeah, just doing some cast shadow and continuing on the shading. Finally, the last technique I'd like to explain on this drawing is rendering. Basically, when I render, I'll start out from the shadowed area. I'll start it out by making a thick line, and as I pull away from it, I'll just feather it out to make it thin. And rendering is used in order to show, I guess you could say, fading from dark to light. And you can also use it to show the form of your object. However, you do want to try to keep this simple. You don't want to over render it, because it's possible to over render your drawing. I have done it in the past, and sometimes I tend to do it still. And it's not that it doesn't look good, it's just sometimes it could just be a little too overwhelming. So just, you know, be careful when you do rendering. And what I've learned up to this point now is to try to keep my rendering closer to the areas that are darker. Like for example, right here on Hunk, the light source is coming up from the top right. For the light source, I chose to make it a spotlight from a helicopter. So the areas that go more towards his legs, I'll try to keep the rendering more down in that area. I'll still put rendering up towards going to the light. However, I'll try not to make it as thick or overcrowded, because as I said, you can overdo it, and if you overdo it, it can overpower the illustration. So just be really careful when you render. If you want a really good artist to show you how to render, check out David Finch. He's basically the master of rendering. He knows how to do his thing. Check out his YouTube channel. I've learned a lot from him. So yeah, just go easy on the rendering. And finally, right here, I'm doing some rendering on Hunk's pants. As I said, I try to keep the rendering more thicker and complicated towards the areas that are in the dark. So as you can see, as I said, I start out in the shadow areas. I'll build it up, and as I come out, I'll taper it by lessening the pressure on the pencil. Right here, what I'm doing is, as I spoke earlier in the introduction, is some cross hatching, and it's basically just going over your rendering lines in a different direction. And what that does is it builds up the amount of darkness you show or convey in certain areas. And this technique, I've actually seen it used not just by comic book artists, but also by people like Frank Cho. He'll do these really intricate, beautiful drawings in ballpoint pen. And what he'll do is he'll create the lines to do the shading, and he'll turn the paper around and he'll do lines in a different direction, and he'll keep turning the paper and doing the same technique. And what that does, it builds up the shading in the drawing. So essentially you can kind of do that with rendering and comic book style drawing, but you know, just using rendering lines going in different directions, and that builds up a little bit more darkness. So the more lines you put in going in different directions, the darker it'll look. The less you put in, you know, the more lighter it'll look. And here we are finishing up the drawing. At this point, what I'm doing is putting some rainfall coming down on top of Hunk. Behind him, put some little splashes of water, some water puddles all over her suit, on the briefcase. I didn't show myself drawing the background because I didn't want to make this video take up too much time, so I just shortened it down to show myself drawing Hunk himself. And for all you RE fans that know, this is gonna be the rooftop of the RPD on the 4th Survivor game. That's where the mission ends. He ends up on top of the RPD to wait for his chopper after a successful mission of stealing the G-Virus from William Birkin. And here we are, adding a little bit more shading, zooming in, getting ready for that dramatic zoom out, and bam, Hunk from Resident Evil 2, as I promised, complete with this background, again on top of the RPD rooftop where the helicopter crashes. You see that scene come out on scenario B of the original Resident Evil for PlayStation 1. And here we have all the details, the rendering, the shading, the little tiles on the rooftop, the briefcase where the G-Virus is stored. And yeah, that is it. Zoom in a little more to show you guys the face mask, the helmet and whatnot, and zoom out a little bit more for the final shot. And that's it. We have our full drawing right here. As I said, Hunk from Resident Evil 2. I hope you guys enjoyed the video as well as learned something. If you did, please remember to rate, comment, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to blast that little bell icon in order to get notifications of when I upload new videos so you won't miss out on anything. Until then, keep practicing. I'll see you on the next one.